late summer of the year 1941, in an apartment in Vienna, a young doctor stood holding a piece of paper that could save his life and could not decide what to do with it. He was 36 years old, a neurologist and psychiatrist of growing reputation, and the paper in his hand was an American immigration visa, granted after a long wait, at a moment when such a document was very nearly the most valuable object in the world. Vienna had been under Nazi rule for 3 years. The persecution of the city's Jews had moved, month by month, from humiliation to exclusion, to something whose full shape no one yet dared to name, but which everyone could feel approaching like weather. The visa in his hand was a door out. It had his name on it, and it had no one else's. That was the difficulty. The visa was for him alone. His elderly parents could not come. If he used it, he would step through the door and it would close behind him, and they would remain on the other side, in a city that was becoming, week by week, a trap. If he did not use it, the door would close anyway, with him still inside. He was a man who had spent his adult life thinking about the meaning of human existence, who had already begun to build a system of therapy around the conviction that a person can find meaning in any circumstance whatsoever. And now, standing in his parents' apartment, with his own survival folded in his hand, he could not for the life of him work out what the meaningful thing to do would be. He went out and walked and thought and came to no conclusion, and went into St. Stephen's Cathedral to sit in the dim and listen to the organ. And still no answer came. And when he returned to the apartment, he saw a small piece of marble lying on the table and asked his father what it was. His father explained that he had picked it up from the rubble of a synagogue the Nazis had burned down, and that the fragment was part of the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, and that a single Hebrew letter remained legible on it. He told his son which commandment that letter belonged to. It was the one about honoring your father and your mother, so that your days may be long upon the land. Frankl let the visa lapse. He stayed in Vienna with his parents, and within a year, he and his family were deported. And over the following 3 years, he was moved through 4 camps. And by the end of the war, his father, his mother, his brother, and his young wife were all dead, and he was alive and alone and 39 years old, and everything he had been building his life's work upon had been taken into the darkest place human beings have ever made and tested there to destruction. The irony was almost too perfect and too terrible. Here was a man who had developed, before the war, a psychology built on the idea that the deepest human drive is not the pursuit of pleasure and not the pursuit of power, but the search for meaning, and that this search can be satisfied under any conditions at all. He had written the manuscript setting out this theory and was preparing it for publication, and history took him and put his theory in the one place on earth designed to prove it false, a place engineered to strip a person of everything, of name, of clothing, of family, of dignity, of any conceivable reason to go on, and it held him there for 3 years and said, in effect, find meaning here. What makes Viktor Frankl one of the most extraordinary figures of the last century is not that he survived. Many survived by luck, and luck was very nearly all of it. He said so himself, often and firmly, and grew impatient with any suggestion that the survivors were the better or the stronger ones. What makes him extraordinary is that he went into that place carrying a hypothesis about human existence and came out of it saying that the hypothesis had held. Not that suffering is good, Not that the years had taught some redemptive lesson that justified them. He rejected that idea entirely and said clearly that no meaning could ever justify such a thing, but that even there, in the last extremity, stripped of everything a human being can be stripped of, some people found something to live for, and the ones who found it were the ones who could bear the unbearable, and that this fact tells us something true and permanent about what a person is. His account of it reads, across the decades since, less like a memoir of a vanished catastrophe than like something addressed quietly to anyone awake in the dark and wondering what the point of their own difficult life might be. He was not interested in horror for its own sake and refused to write about it that way. He was interested in the one thing the horror could not reach. The journey that follows moves through the whole of that life, slowly, in its own time. It begins in the Vienna of the century's early years, in the childhood of a boy who lay awake at night, asking what the meaning of it all could be, and who grew up in the very city where the modern science of the mind was being invented, corresponding as a schoolboy with Freud himself. It moves through the making of the young psychiatrist, his break from the great schools of his teachers, and the founding of the therapy of meaning that he called logotherapy, tested first among the despairing young people of the city. It follows him to the choice in his parents' apartment, and then into the years he never sensationalized and always described with restraint, and to the observations he made there about what keeps a person alive when every external reason to live has been removed. And it follows him out again into the astonishing second half of his life, the writing of the small book that would reach many millions of readers, the long decades of teaching, the tragic optimism he professed into his 90s, the insistence from a man who had every conceivable right to despair that it is possible to say yes to life in spite of everything. Each phase grew out of the one before it, and all of it circles a single question, the one he lay awake with as a boy and never stopped asking, which is what a human being is for. It is a long road, and there is no hurry on it. Let it unfold at the pace of breathing. Long before the camps, before the visa, before any of it, there was a boy in Vienna who could not sleep for thinking. Viktor Frankl was born on the 26th of March, in the year 1905, in the Leopoldstadt district of Vienna, the second of 3 children, in a Jewish family of modest means and considerable seriousness. His father was a civil servant, an upright, rather austere man who had wanted to study medicine and had been unable to afford it, and who brought to the raising of his children a strong sense of duty and order. His mother was warmer, gentler, a woman of kindness whom Frankl adored. The Vienna they lived in was the Vienna of the last years of the Habsburg Empire, a city of extraordinary intellectual ferment, where the arts and the sciences and the new and scandalous study of the human mind were all boiling at once, and where a bright child of the right disposition could absorb, simply by growing up there, the sense that the deepest questions were live questions, and that a person might make a life out of asking them. The question that seized Frankl seized him very early. He remembered, as a boy of perhaps 4, waking suddenly in the night with the thought that he too would one day die. And the fear that gripped him then was not, he later said, the fear of dying itself so much as the question that dying raised, whether the transitoriness of life destroyed its meaning. That question, arrived at in a child's bed in the small hours, never left him. He would spend 92 years answering it, and the answer he eventually gave, that transitoriness does not destroy meaning, but is precisely what makes meaning possible, that it is the very finitude of our time that makes what we do with it matter, would be worked out and tested in circumstances the boy in the dark could not have imagined. As a schoolboy, he was serious, argumentative, hungry, drawn to the new science of psychology as to a magnet. He read voraciously, attended public lectures on the mind, and, with an audacity that is hard to credit, began as a teenager to correspond directly with Sigmund Freud, who was then at the height of his fame and living a few districts away. Freud, remarkably, wrote back, and the correspondence continued for some years. And when the young Frankl sent him a short paper he had written, Freud forwarded it to a psychoanalytic journal, where it was published while its author was still a schoolboy. It was an extraordinary beginning, and it is worth noting, because of what came later, that Frankl's entry into the world of ideas came through the front door of the psychoanalytic establishment at the invitation of its founder. He was not an outsider throwing stones at the great systems. He was an insider who would come, gradually and respectfully, and then decisively, to believe that the great systems had left out the most important thing. The break, when it came, was not made in anger, and this is characteristic of him. Frankl never repudiated Freud, and spoke of him throughout his life with genuine reverence, calling him a giant, and insisting that those who came after stood on his shoulders and could therefore see a little further, which is not a criticism of the shoulders. He simply thought that a psychology built entirely on what drives us from behind had failed to notice what draws us from ahead. A human being, in his image, is not primarily pushed by instincts, but pulled by meanings. And there is all the difference in the world between the two, because a push leaves no room for a decision, and a pull requires one. We are not compelled by the values that call to us. We are invited by them, and we may accept or decline. And it is in the accepting and declining that a person becomes who they are. He also came to reject, with more force, a habit of mind he called reductionism, the tendency of the sciences of his day to explain the higher by the lower, and to imagine that in doing so they had explained it away. Love reduced to sublimated instinct, conscience reduced to the internalized father. The whole life of the spirit treated as a decorative surface over more basic mechanisms. Frankl thought this was not merely an error of theory, but a kind of cultural catastrophe, because a person who has been taught that their loves and their ideals are nothing but disguised drives has been robbed of the very things that make life bearable. He was fond of pointing out that a shadow cast on a wall is a real projection of a real object, but that anyone who took the shadow for the whole thing would have understood nothing. And he insisted that the human capacity for meaning, for self-transcendence, for reaching beyond oneself toward a cause or a person, is not a shadow of something more basic. It is the most basic thing there is about us. What they had left out was meaning. Vienna in those years was the home of two great and rival schools of psychology, and the young Frankl studied both and found both, in the end, insufficient. There was Freud's psychoanalysis, which held that the fundamental drive of the human being is the will to pleasure, that we are creatures pushed from behind by instinct and desire, and that our neuroses arise from the repression of those drives. And there was the individual psychology of Alfred Adler, Freud's great defector, who held that the fundamental drive is rather the will to power, the striving to overcome inferiority and to achieve significance and mastery. Frankl worked within Adler's circle for a time, as he had corresponded within Freud's, and he learned enormously from both men. And he came, slowly, to the conviction that both had described something real, and neither had described the deepest thing. For when he looked at the people around him, and later at the patients who came to him, he saw a suffering that neither system could account for. He saw people who had pleasure in abundance and were miserable. He saw people who had achieved power and standing and found their achievements hollow. He saw, most of all, a particular kind of modern despair that seemed to have nothing to do with repressed drives or with feelings of inferiority, and everything to do with a sense that life had become empty, that there was no reason to get up in the morning, that nothing mattered. He would later give this condition a name, the existential vacuum, and would argue that it was becoming the characteristic malady of the age. And he concluded that beneath the will to pleasure and beneath the will to power, there lies something more fundamental, which he called the will to meaning, the deep and specifically human need to find a reason, a purpose, a why. Pleasure, he came to think, is not the goal of human striving, but a byproduct of it, something that arrives on its own when we are absorbed in a meaningful task, and that recedes the moment we pursue it directly. Power is merely a means. Meaning is the thing itself. He was careful, always, to insist that this will to meaning is not a matter of the intellect, not a philosophical taste that some people happen to have, and others do not. It is as basic to a human being as hunger, and its frustration produces suffering as reliably as the frustration of any bodily need. A person deprived of meaning does not simply become thoughtful or wistful. They become ill in a manner that shows itself in the whole organism, in apathy and depression and a slow withdrawal from life. And conversely, a person who has found a meaning can endure deprivations of almost every other kind, can go without comfort and security, and even without hope of a good outcome, and remain in some essential way intact. Frankl liked to point out that this runs directly against the assumptions of the comfortable societies of the modern West, which arrange themselves around the reduction of tension, around the pursuit of equilibrium and ease, on the theory that a person is happiest when least disturbed. He believed the opposite. What a person actually needs, he wrote, is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for some goal worthy of them, not the discharge of tension at any cost, but the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled. A certain kind of tension, the gap between what we are and what we are called to become, is not a symptom to be cured. It is the very condition of a healthy human life. This was the founding insight of what he would call logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning here reason, or sense, or meaning itself. It was to be, he said, the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, standing alongside the schools of Freud and Adler, and correcting what he saw as their shared blind spot, where psychoanalysis asked a patient to look backward into the buried history of their drives. Logotherapy would ask them to look forward and outward toward a task waiting to be done, a person waiting to be loved, a meaning waiting to be fulfilled. It was, in the deepest sense, a psychology of the future rather than the past, and it rested on a conviction about human nature that would be tested more severely than any theory has ever been tested. The conviction that a human being is not finally determined by their conditions, that between what happens to us and how we respond, there is always a space, and that in that space lies everything that makes us human. He did not develop these ideas in a study, in the abstract. As a young man building a system for the pleasure of building it, he developed them among the young and the despairing, in the streets and rooms of a city under strain. And this practical origin marks everything about logotherapy and gives it a quality that more academic psychologies lack. In the 1920s, while still a medical student, Frankl became involved in the socialist youth movement and turned his attention to a problem that was then acute in Vienna. Each year, at the end of the school term, when report cards were handed out, there was a rise in suicides among young people who had failed, or who feared failure, or who could not face what a poor result would mean in their families and their futures. The pattern was known and lamented and largely accepted as one of those grim facts of life about which nothing could be done. Frankl thought something could be done. He organized with others a program of free youth counseling centers across the city, staffed by volunteers, psychologists and doctors who gave their time, and he arranged for them to be open and available precisely at the critical moment in the days around the handing out of the reports. Young people came and were listened to and were helped to see that a school result was not a verdict on a life, that the future was still open, that there were reasons to go on that had nothing to do with a grade. And in the year 1931, for the first time in living memory, not a single student suicide was recorded in Vienna. It was a young man's victory, and it stayed with him. It stayed with him not least because of what it proved about the nature of despair. The students who came to those counseling centers were not, for the most part, suffering from a hidden pathology. They were suffering from a situation that seemed to them to have foreclosed the future, and what they needed was not to be cured, but to be shown that the future was still open. Frankl saw in this a general truth about the human being in trouble. A great deal of what presents itself as illness is in fact a person's entirely reasonable response to a life that appears to have run out of possibilities. And the treatment for it is not primarily chemical or archaeological, not a matter of adjusting the machinery or excavating the childhood, but a matter of restoring the sense that something still lies ahead that requires them. Give a person back their future, and very often the symptoms will look after themselves. He was working, of course, in a city that was itself sliding into a crisis of meaning, in the years when the old empire had collapsed and the new order had not yet formed, and the economic ground was giving way beneath ordinary families. And it did not escape him that the private despair of a young student and the public despair of a society are not unrelated. He would later argue that the great collective madnesses of the 20th century fed precisely on the vacuum left when the traditions that once told people what their lives were for had dissolved, and that a person or a people who cannot find a meaning of their own will accept gratefully and dangerously any meaning that is offered loudly enough. He had seen the beginning of that process from inside, as a young doctor sitting with young people in a city where the ground was moving, and it shaped his conviction that the search for meaning is not a private luxury, but something on which a civilization's health depends. He had seen, in the most direct and practical way, that despair is not simply a chemical fact or a private failing, that it can be met, that it responds to being heard and to being given a why, and that a person who can be helped to find a reason to live will very often live. The work brought him into contact with the full range of human unhappiness in a city where unhappiness was everywhere increasing, and it confirmed his growing conviction that the crucial question was always one of meaning. He worked, after qualifying, in the great psychiatric hospitals of Vienna, in the wards for the suicidal, where he treated thousands of women who had attempted to end their lives, and he learned to sit with people at the very end of their resources and to ask, gently, not what was wrong with them, but what remained for them. What task or person or possibility still called to them from the future? And he found, again and again, that if something could be found, however small, it could carry a person through, and that where nothing could be found, the danger was mortal. It was clinical experience, gathered patiently over years, that gave him his central claim, and it is why he could later say, with such conviction, that a person who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Out of that same clinical work came a therapeutic technique of his own devising, which shows the practical and even playful side of a man, usually remembered only for the gravest of subjects. He noticed that a great deal of ordinary neurotic suffering is produced not by the original symptom, but by the terror of the symptom returning, so that a person who has once been unable to sleep becomes so afraid of sleeplessness that the fear itself guarantees the wakefulness, and a person who has once blushed or stammered in company becomes so anxious about doing it again that the anxiety produces the very thing they dread. Frankl called this anticipatory anxiety, and he devised against it a strategy he named paradoxical intention, which consisted in inviting the patient to wish for, and even to exaggerate, the very thing they feared. The man, terrified of sweating in public, was encouraged to resolve to sweat as copiously as he possibly could, to show people what real sweating looked like. The insomniac was advised to lie down and try, deliberately, to stay awake all night, and the fear, deprived of its object, would repeatedly collapse, often with laughter, for it is very difficult to be afraid of something you are actively attempting to bring about. The technique worked, sometimes remarkably fast, in cases that had resisted years of other treatment, and it rested on the same conviction that runs through all his work, that a human being is not simply at the mercy of their own psychic machinery, that there is a capacity in us to take a stand toward our own symptoms, and even to regard them with humor, and that this self-detachment, this ability to step back from oneself and smile, is one of the distinctively human resources, and one of the most healing. By the late 1930s, he was an established young specialist, head of the neurological department at the Rothschild Hospital, the only hospital in Vienna where Jewish patients could still be treated after the Nazi annexation of Austria. Here his work took on a new and dangerous dimension. The regime had begun its program of murdering the mentally ill, and Frankl, in his position, deliberately falsified diagnoses to save the lives of patients who would otherwise have been taken, describing them in his reports in terms that would not attract the attention of the authorities. It was quiet, risky, unglamorous resistance, conducted in the language of medical paperwork, and it went on for as long as the hospital was permitted to exist. He was, in these years, already living the thing he taught, finding in an impossible situation the small space in which a person can still act, and acting there. It was during these same years that he met and married Tilly Grosser, a young nurse at the hospital. Their wedding, in the December of 1941, was among the last permitted to Jewish couples in Vienna, and the times pressed in on even that. She became pregnant not long after. And under the regulations then in force, Jewish women were forbidden to bear children, and the pregnancy had to be ended. Frankl would later dedicate one of his books to the child who was never born. It is a detail he mentioned rarely, and never with self-pity, and it stands as one of those quiet, private losses that history piles up without noticing, beneath the vast statistics that get remembered. And it was in this atmosphere, with the walls closing, that the visa came. We began with that moment, with the young doctor holding his own survival in his hand and unable to decide. And it is worth returning to it now, that we know something of the man who stood there. Everything in his professional prospects argued for going. He had a manuscript nearly finished, the first full statement of logotherapy, the work of his intellectual life. In America, it could be published and read, and could perhaps save others, while in Vienna, it would very likely be destroyed, along with its author. Everything in his personal loyalty argued for staying. His parents were old and frightened, and they would be alone. He has told us that he went looking for a sign, and that he found one. In a fragment of stone, his father had rescued from the rubble of a burned synagogue, bearing a letter from the commandment about honoring one's father and mother. It would be easy, from a comfortable distance, to be skeptical about such a sign, to say that a man in an agony of indecision will find a portent in anything, and that the stone told him only what some part of him had already chosen. Frankl himself was too subtle a thinker not to know this, but that is rather the point, and it illuminates something essential about his whole philosophy. Meaning, for Frankl, is never a proposition proved by argument. It is something perceived, recognized, responded to in a particular situation by a particular person who is willing to be addressed by their life. The stone did not contain a message in the way a letter does. It offered him the occasion to recognize what his own conscience already knew. And the recognition was real, and he acted on it. And the action cost him almost everything, and was, by his own reckoning ever afterward, the right one. He let the visa expire. He stayed. And in the September of the year 1942, he and his wife and his parents were arrested and put on a transport. And the world he had known ended. Of the 3 years that followed, Frankl wrote sparingly and with great restraint. And it is worth honoring the way he chose to tell it, because the choice was deliberate and it was philosophical. He did not write an account of atrocity. He said plainly that his purpose was not to describe the great horrors, which had already been described often enough, but to describe the small daily sufferings, and above all, to ask a psychological question about them. His book is not a catalogue of what was done to people. It is an inquiry into what happened inside them, and what it was that made the difference between those who went under and those who somehow, for as long as chance permitted, did not. We will follow him at that same distance, and with the same restraint, because the meaning of his years there does not lie in the details of the cruelty, but in what he found underneath it. The first thing that happened, in the first hours, was the stripping away. The transport arrived, and the prisoners were taken from the train, and everything was removed from them. Every possession, every document, the clothes they wore, the hair on their bodies, their names, which were replaced by numbers. Frankl described standing there afterward with nothing at all, and realizing, with a kind of shock that took some time to fully arrive, that there was literally nothing left of his former life but his bare existence. And with everything else, there went the manuscript, the book of his life's work, the first full statement of logotherapy, which he had sewn into the lining of his coat, and which he had believed obscurely he might somehow be able to keep. The coat was taken with everything else. The work of years was gone. He wrote about the moment he understood this, and about the strange interior struggle that followed, in which he had to decide whether his life still had a purpose now that the thing he had lived for had been destroyed. Some weeks later, ill with typhus, he began secretly reconstructing the lost book, writing key words in shorthand on scraps of paper he managed to obtain. And he believed that the effort of that reconstruction, the sheer fact of having a task that reached beyond the present hour, helped him to survive the fever. It is a small detail, and it contains the whole of his teaching. The manuscript could be taken. The relationship to the manuscript, the sense that there was still something waiting to be completed, could not, and that unfinished task became a thread stretching out of the present misery into a possible future. And a person who is holding such a thread has something to hold. For this was the observation that formed the center of everything he wrote afterward, in a situation where every external circumstance had been equalized, where all the prisoners had been reduced to the same nakedness, the same hunger, the same cold, the same absolute powerlessness. There were nevertheless enormous differences in how people bore it, and those differences could not be explained by the conditions, because the conditions were the same. Something else was operating. Some people he saw gave up. There was a recognizable moment, which the prisoners themselves came to know and dread, when a man would simply stop, refuse to rise, lie in his own filth, and no longer respond to threats or appeals. And such a man was almost always dead within days. And other people, in the identical circumstances, retained something, an inner posture, a bearing, and went on. And most striking of all, he saw men, not many, but enough to make the fact undeniable, who walked through the huts comforting others and giving away their last piece of bread. They were few in number, he wrote, but they offered sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, which is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This sentence is the hinge of his entire philosophy, and everything before it in his life led up to it, and everything after it flowed from it. He had believed as a young theorist that a human being is not merely the product of conditions, that we are not simply pushed from behind by drives or shaped entirely by environment, that there is always a margin of freedom in which we determine what we shall make of what has been made of us. He had believed it, and now he had seen it, in the only laboratory that could ever have tested it properly. And it had held. The conditions had done everything conceivable to reduce a human being to a mere reaction. And even there, in some people, the last freedom had survived. It is important to be careful here, and Frankl was scrupulously careful, because this idea can be twisted into something cruel. He was not saying that the people who died had failed to choose the right attitude, that survival was a matter of spiritual merit and death a matter of spiritual failure. He said the opposite, repeatedly and emphatically. Survival was overwhelmingly a matter of luck, of which line one was directed into, of which transport one was placed on, of the accident of an illness or a guard's whim, and the best often died first, precisely because they gave away their bread. He was not describing a technique for survival. He was describing a fact about human freedom, that even in the last extremity, it is not wholly extinguished, and that the existence of this freedom, even where it cannot save a life, is what makes a human being something other than a thing. He put the philosophical point sharply against the intellectual fashions of his own century, which had grown very fond of explaining human beings entirely in terms of their conditions. A person is not fully conditioned and determined, he wrote, but rather determines whether to give in to conditions or to stand up to them. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. He was contradicting, deliberately, both the biological determinism that reduces a person to their drives and the sociological determinism that reduces them to their circumstances. And he was doing it not as an armchair argument, but on the strength of what he had watched with his own eyes. He had seen, he said, that human beings are capable of anything, both of the worst and of the best, and that which of these a person actualizes depends not on conditions alone, but on decisions. The same conditions had produced in that place both those who behaved like beasts and those who behaved like saints. And the difference could not have come from the conditions, since the conditions were identical. It had to have come from somewhere inside, from the exercise of a freedom that the whole apparatus of coercion had failed to abolish. And this, he came to believe, is the ground of human dignity, and the reason he insisted so firmly that a human being must never be treated as a mere means, a thing to be used, a mechanism to be adjusted. If we present a person as nothing but the product of heredity and environment, as a machine to be repaired, we not only misdescribe them, but do them a subtle injury. For we take from them the very thing that makes their life a life, rather than a process. Frankl had seen a system built on precisely that premise, on the reduction of persons to material, and he had watched what it produced. And he never afterward regarded the philosophical question as academic. How a civilization answers the question of what a human being is turns out, in the end, to determine what it feels entitled to do to them. And the freedom, he found, was exercised above all in the inner life, which the conditions could not directly touch. He described how the prisoners' inner lives did not, as one might expect, simply shrivel under the pressure of physical extremity, but in some cases deepened. How men who had never in their lives paid attention to art or nature, or the life of the spirit, found themselves suddenly and intensely moved by such things. How the sight of a sunset over the mountains, glimpsed through the door of a hut after a day of labor, could stop a whole group of exhausted men in silence, and how someone would say, out of that silence, how beautiful the world could be. In a place engineered to destroy the inner life, some part of the inner life, in some people, grew. He described, too, the surprising persistence of humor in such a place, and he insisted that this was not a trivial observation, but a serious psychological finding. Humor, he wrote, is another of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation, and he recounted how he and a friend had made a kind of practice of it, agreeing to invent together at least one amusing story every day about something that might happen to them after the liberation. Small, absurd fantasies of their future lives, told in whispers during the labor. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. Those few seconds mattered. To be able to laugh, even briefly, even bitterly, is to have placed a distance between oneself and one's circumstances. And that distance is precisely the space in which the last freedom lives. A person who can still make a joke has not yet been entirely absorbed by what is being done to them. And Frankl watched carefully for that sign in others. and cultivated it deliberately in himself. He noticed as well the strange phenomenon he called the relativity of suffering, that a person's despair is not proportional to the objective magnitude of their trouble, that the size of a human suffering is absolute and fills the whole soul regardless of how small or great the cause. Suffering, he said, is like a gas. A small quantity of gas will fill a chamber just as completely and evenly as a great quantity, whatever the size of the chamber. This observation is one of the most useful things he ever offered to people whose lives have contained no catastrophe at all, for it means that the sorrows of an ordinary life are not disqualified from seriousness by comparison with greater sorrows elsewhere, and that a person need not have survived a catastrophe in order for their own struggle to be real, and for the search for meaning within it to matter. The deepest of these inner discoveries, and the one he wrote about with the most tenderness, concerned love. He described a morning march, before dawn, in bitter cold, stumbling in the dark over stones and through puddles. The men prodded along by shouts and blows. Nobody speaking, the wind cutting through the thin clothing. And in that march his mind turned, as it had been turning more and more often, to the image of his wife. He saw her face in his imagination with an extraordinary vividness, more real, he said, than the sun that was then beginning to rise. He spoke to her in his mind and heard her answering and saw her smile, and the conversation continued as he stumbled forward in the dark. And a thought came to him then that he called the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart, which is that the salvation of a human being is through love, and in love. What made the insight so powerful was the circumstance in which it arrived. He did not know at that moment whether his wife was alive or dead. He had no way of finding out, and no reason for optimism. And he understood, marching in the dark, that it did not matter for the purposes of what he was experiencing, that the love he felt and the presence he was communing with did not depend on her physical existence at all. He grasped, he said, that love goes far beyond the physical person of the beloved, that it finds its deepest meaning in the spiritual being of the other, and that whether or not that other is still bodily present, whether they are still alive, ceases to be somehow of importance to the love itself. A man who has nothing left in this world may still know bliss, be it only for a brief moment. In the contemplation of his beloved, he was in a place designed to demonstrate that a person is nothing but a body to be worked and disposed of. And he had found, in the coldest hour of a winter morning, that the most important thing about him was a relationship that the place could not reach, to a woman it could not touch, whose face he could summon and speak to whenever the guards were not watching. Tilly, he learned after the liberation, had died. She had survived the transports only to die in another camp, at the age of 24, in the chaos of the war's final weeks, possibly after liberation, from illness and starvation. The love he had communed with on the dark morning march had, in all likelihood, already lost its object by the time he was speaking to it. He never said that this made the experience false. He said, rather, that it proved his point. The meaning he had found in that hour was real, and it had carried him, and it did not depend upon an outcome. This is one of the hardest and most consoling things in all of his thought, and it is worth sitting with in the quiet. The love we give is not made worthless by loss. It has already done what it did. It was already real. From these observations came the principle that Frankl placed at the very center of his teaching. And he liked to state it in a phrase he borrowed from Nietzsche, which he found to be almost literally true in the conditions he had lived through. He who has a why to live, the line runs, can bear with almost any how. Frankl saw this operating with a kind of terrible clarity. The men who held on were, almost without exception, the men who had something waiting for them, some task unfinished, some person to be found again, some purpose that reached out of the camp and into a future, however uncertain. And the men who lost that thread, who could no longer point to anything in the future that was expecting them, tended to collapse with frightening speed. And the collapse was of the whole organism, body and spirit together. He told a story that illustrated this with a starkness he never forgot. A fellow prisoner, a composer, told him one day of a dream he had had, in which a voice offered to answer any question, and he had asked when the war would end for him, and the voice had named a date in the spring. The man was full of hope as the date approached. When the day came and passed and the promised liberation did not arrive, he fell ill within hours, and within days he was dead, of a fever that had been circulating in the camp for weeks without touching him. His resistance had collapsed together with his hope. Frankl drew from this the conclusion that governed the rest of his career, that the loss of a why is not merely a psychological event, but something that reaches down into the body itself, and that faith in the future, in a meaning waiting to be fulfilled, is not a luxury of the comfortable, but very nearly a physical necessity, the thing that holds a person together. He also noticed the same collapse in a subtler and more widespread form, which he called provisional existence. The prisoners, unable to know how long their situation would last, tended to stop regarding their present life as real. It was an interruption, an interlude, a period to be got through until the real life resumed on the other side, and everything within it was therefore meaningless by definition. And this attitude, understandable as it was, corroded the person who held it. Frankl came to believe that the only way to survive spiritually was to refuse it, to insist that this present hour, however wretched, was still one's actual life, that whatever could be made of it was being made of one's real and only existence, and that the moral choices and the small kindnesses and the inner attitude one adopted right now were not provisional at all, but were, in fact, the whole of the matter. And he practiced what he taught in a way that has become one of the most quietly astonishing images of the whole century. When his own morale began to falter, when the misery of an hour became almost insupportable, he would use a technique of the imagination. He would picture himself standing at a lectern in a warm, well-lit hall after the war, delivering a lecture to an attentive audience on the psychology of the concentration camp, and describing to them the very things that were happening to him at that moment. In doing this, he placed himself, in his mind, in a future from which the present could be looked back upon, and the present, so regarded, became something he was observing and would one day describe, rather than merely something he was drowning in. The suffering became, in that act of imagination, material, a thing with a purpose, an experience that would one day be of use to others. It is a demonstration of his central claim, performed on himself, under conditions where a failed demonstration meant death. He turned his misery into a lecture he had not yet given, and by doing so, he survived to give it. He generalized this technique afterward into a piece of practical counsel that he offered to patients for the rest of his career. And it is perhaps the most portable single thing in all of logotherapy. Live as if you were living for the second time, he would say, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. It sounds, at first hearing, like a riddle, but its effect is immediate. It places a person, in imagination, at a point beyond the present moment, looking back on it. And from that vantage, the choice at hand appears in an entirely different light, no longer as a small, isolated decision, but as something that will have been part of a life. We are extraordinarily bad at seeing the present hour as it will one day look to us, and we are extraordinarily good at seeing the past that way. And the trick simply lends the clarity of the second to the material of the first. It was the same move he had made in the camp when he imagined the lecture hall, and it works in a smaller way, in an ordinary life. Whatever this evening's difficulty is, it is already becoming part of a story you will one day be able to tell. The question is, what kind of part? The liberation, when it came in the spring of the year 1945, was not the ending that such a story seems to promise. And Frankl was honest about this in a way that few accounts are. He described the strange, flattened quality of the first days of freedom. How the prisoners walked out through the gates and into the meadows and found that they could not feel joy, that the capacity for it seemed to have been used up, that they had to learn to be glad again, slowly, like a skill relearned after an injury. And then, gradually, came the discoveries. He made his way back toward Vienna, asking after his family as he went. And one by one, the answers came. His father had died in Theresienstadt, of illness and hunger, in Frankl's presence. And that at least had been a kind of mercy, that he had been there. His mother had been killed at Auschwitz. His brother had died in a mining detail, and Tilly, whom he had spoken to on the dark morning march, whose face had been more real to him than the rising sun, had died at Bergen-Belsen at 24. He was 39 years old, and everyone he had chosen to stay for was gone. The visa he had let expire, the decision made in front of a fragment of stone, had not in the end saved the people it was made for. This is the fact that sits at the bottom of Frankl's life and cannot be argued away. And it is why his philosophy has a weight that more comfortable philosophies do not. He was not a man who had theorized about meaning from a study and been fortunate. He was a man whose great act of loyalty had failed to save anyone, whose life's work had been destroyed and rebuilt, who had lost the entire world he came from, and who then, out of that, said what he said. What he did in the months after his return has become one of the most remarkable facts about him. Living in a shattered city, alone, grieving, he sat down and dictated a book, and he dictated it in 9 days. It was not the reconstruction of the lost scientific manuscript, though that came too. It was something else, an account of what he had observed and concluded about the human being under extremity. He intended to publish it anonymously, and did so in its first edition, because he wanted the argument to stand without the authority of a survivor's testimony behind it, and because he had no expectation whatsoever that it would find readers. He thought of it as a small technical contribution, evidence for a thesis. That book, in English, became Man's Search for Meaning, and it has since sold many millions of copies in dozens of languages, and has been named, in surveys of readers, among the most influential books of the century. He was always faintly bewildered by this, and took from it a lesson he liked to repeat, that the very success he had never sought had come precisely because he had not sought it. That success, like happiness, cannot be pursued directly, but must ensue as the unintended side effect of dedication to something greater than oneself. The system he set out afterward, refined across half a century of teaching and practice, is at bottom very simple, and its simplicity is part of its power. Meaning, Frankl taught, is not a single abstract thing that a person either possesses or lacks, and it is certainly not something invented arbitrarily by the will. It is discovered in concrete situations, and it can be discovered along 3 distinct roads. And every human life, however constrained, has access to at least one of them. The first road is through what we create or accomplish, through work, through a deed, through what we give to the world. This is the most obvious source of meaning, and the one our societies most readily recognize. The meaning of a task well done, a thing made, a contribution offered. The second road is through what we experience or encounter, through the reception of the world's goodness, through beauty, through nature, through art, and above all, through love, through the encounter with another person in their absolute uniqueness. Frankl always insisted that love is a way of grasping another human being at the deepest level, of seeing not only what they are, but what they might become, and that in loving, we enable in the other the very potential we perceive. The exhausted men stopping to look at a sunset, the man on the dark march speaking to his wife's face, were traveling this second road under conditions that had closed the first. And the third road is the one that made his philosophy unlike any other. And it is the road he had walked himself. It is the meaning available through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. Frankl was precise about this, and his precision matters because the idea is so easily and so badly misunderstood. He never said that suffering is necessary for meaning, and he never said suffering is good, and he warned explicitly against seeking it out. A person who suffers unnecessarily when the suffering could be removed is not being heroic, but merely masochistic. And the first duty in the face of removable suffering is to remove it. But there is suffering that cannot be removed, the loss that cannot be undone, the illness that cannot be cured, the fate that cannot be altered. And when a person is faced with such a thing, when the situation itself cannot be changed, then the challenge changes, and it becomes a question of what the person will make of the unchangeable. And here, he said, is a final and unassailable opportunity, because in the way we bear what cannot be helped, we are still deciding something, still bearing witness to what a human being can be, still, in that last and narrowest of spaces, free. He illustrated this third road with a story from his practice that he told many times, and it shows how gently and how practically he worked. An elderly physician came to him, severely depressed, unable to recover from the death of his wife 2 years before, whom he had loved above everything. Frankl did not offer him consolation or argument. He asked him a question. What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife had survived you? The old man said that it would have been terrible for her, that she would have suffered enormously. And Frankl said, you see, she has been spared that, and it was you who spared her. And the price you are paying is that you must survive and mourn her. The man said nothing, shook Frankl's hand, and left the office. And his suffering, Frankl observed, was not removed because nothing could remove it. but it had ceased to be meaningless. And a suffering that has a meaning is a different kind of suffering and can be borne. He was careful too about how such a meaning is arrived at. And here he differed from almost every therapist of his generation. The meaning cannot be supplied by the doctor, he insisted. It cannot be prescribed or handed over or argued into a person from outside. For a meaning that is not one's own is worth nothing at all. The therapist's task is not to tell the patient what their life means, but to widen their field of vision so that the possibilities of meaning already present in their own situation become visible to them, and then to leave the recognition and the choice entirely in their hands. It is rather like the work of an eye specialist, he said, whose task is not to paint a picture for the patient, but to enable them to see the world as it actually is. This is why logotherapy, for all its convictions, never became a doctrine to be imposed. It asks a question rather than giving an answer, and it trusts that the answer, when it comes, will come from the one place it can legitimately come from, which is the conscience of the person actually living the life in question. And he trusted conscience deeply, describing it as a kind of organ of meaning, the faculty by which a person detects the unique possibility hidden in each situation. Conscience, in his account, is not merely the internalized voice of society's rules. It is something more like an intuition of what is required here, now, of me. And it can even come into conflict with the accepted morality of the day, as it did for a great many people in the years he lived through, when the law itself had become criminal, and only conscience remained to say so. It can also be mistaken, and Frankl accepted this without embarrassment. A person may follow their conscience in good faith and be wrong, and there is no certainty available in advance. But there is no alternative either. For the meaning of a particular life in a particular hour is not the kind of thing that can be settled by a rule, and a person who waits for certainty before acting will wait forever, and will have answered life's question by their silence with a refusal. Nothing about the facts had changed. Everything about the man's relation to the facts had changed, and that was enough. Frankl came to believe that the great sickness of the prosperous modern world was precisely the loss of this dimension, and he named it, as we have seen, the existential vacuum. He observed in the decades after the war a peculiar new kind of patient, materially comfortable, free of the classical neuroses, and yet suffering acutely from a sense of inner emptiness, from boredom, from the feeling that nothing meant anything, that life was a sequence of days to be filled rather than a task to be answered. Modern people, he suggested, had lost both of the things that had told earlier generations what to do. The instincts that guide an animal no longer determine our behavior, and the traditions that guided our ancestors have largely dissolved. And so a person stands in a kind of freedom that is also a vacancy, no longer knowing what they must do, and no longer knowing what they ought to do, and sometimes not even knowing what they wish to do. Into that vacuum, he thought, rush the substitutes, the pursuit of pleasure, of power, of money, of distraction, none of which can fill it, because the vacuum has the shape of meaning, and only meaning fits. And his answer to it was not a doctrine to be adopted, but a reorientation, a turning of the whole question around. Modern people, he said, ask what they expect from life, and are perpetually disappointed. The right question, and the one that has an answer, is what life expects from them. We had to stop asking about the meaning of life, he wrote of the prisoners, and instead think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life, daily and hourly, life poses each of us, at each moment, a specific and concrete question in the form of our actual circumstances, our relationships, our work, our suffering. And the answer we give is not a philosophical proposition, but a course of action, a way of conducting ourselves in the situation that has been handed to us. Meaning, so understood, is not a general truth to be discovered once and possessed forever. It is a particular task presented to a particular person at a particular hour, and it changes as the hours change. And the only way to find it is to answer the question actually being asked of us now. This is why Frankl called himself, in the phrase he coined for his own position, a tragic optimist. He was under no illusions about the world. He had seen more of its capacity for evil than almost any writer who has tried to console us, and he never softened it or explained it away. He accepted what he called the tragic triad of human existence, that we are subject to pain, to guilt, and to death, and that none of these can be evaded by anyone. The optimism he professed was not a denial of these facts, and not a cheerful expectation that things will turn out well, which he would have regarded as childish. It was the conviction that even in the presence of the tragic triad, a person can still say yes to life, can still turn suffering into an achievement, can still derive from guilt the opportunity to change for the better, and can still take from the transitoriness of life an incentive to act responsibly while there is time. Tragic optimism means saying yes to life in spite of everything. In spite of, he insisted, and not because of. The evil is not redeemed. It is simply not the last word. He lived that position for another half-century after the war, and the length and ordinariness of that second life is itself part of what he had to teach. He returned to Vienna, the city that had deported him, and he stayed, which surprised many people, and which he explained by saying that one must not judge a whole people collectively, that he had known Nazis who were decent and prisoners who were not, and that there are only two races of human beings, the decent and the indecent, and both are found everywhere. He resumed his post, and he practiced and taught, and he wrote more than 30 books, and he lectured across the world for decades, holding professorships and receiving honorary degrees in great number. He married again to Eleanor Schwind, and they remained together for over 50 years, and he had a daughter and grandchildren. He learned to fly an aeroplane in his 60s, and at the age of 67, he climbed mountains still, having been a keen and serious climber since youth, and he continued lecturing into his 91st year. The climbing was not incidental, and he spoke of it often as a kind of enacted philosophy. A mountain, he liked to observe, presents a person with a task that is entirely concrete and entirely outside themselves, that must be met with attention and effort in the present moment, and that offers no rewards to the person who merely wishes to have climbed it. The climber does not ask the mountain for meaning. The mountain asks the climber a question, and the climber answers it with their hands and feet, hold by hold. And there is a further point he drew from it, about the way we ought to set our aims. In climbing, one does best to aim slightly higher than one believes oneself capable of, because a person who aims exactly at what they think they can manage will fall short of even that, whereas a person who reaches for a little more will often find the extra capacity was there all along. He applied the same principle to human beings in general, and it is one of the gentlest and most encouraging things in his thought. If we take people as they are, he wrote, we make them worse. If we treat them as if they were what they ought to be, we help them become what they are capable of becoming. He had seen the opposite principle, applied on the largest possible scale, had seen what happens when a system decides in advance that certain people are merely what their worst circumstances make of them. He spent the rest of his life insisting on the other direction, that we should address in each person the possibility rather than the actuality, and that in doing so, we call that possibility into being. There is a proposal from those later years that captures the whole of his thought in a single image, and it has an appealing modesty about it. Frankl suggested, more than once and quite seriously, that the Statue of Liberty on the east coast of the United States ought to be complemented by a statue of responsibility on the west, because freedom, he said, is only half of the story, and is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. To be free from something is not enough. The question is always what one is free for. A person who has been liberated from every constraint and has nothing to answer to has not arrived at the fullness of human life, but at the existential vacuum. And the cure for the vacuum is not more freedom, but a task, someone or something that needs us. A question from life that only we can answer. He had learned this in the place where freedom had been reduced to almost nothing, and had found that even there, the question of responsibility remained, and that answering it was what kept a person human. Viktor Frankl died in Vienna on the 2nd of September, in the year 1997, of heart failure, at the age of 92. He had lived the greater part of a century, most of it after the years that made him known, and he had spent that greater part not brooding on what had been done to him, but working, teaching, climbing, flying, marrying, raising a family, and repeating, in book after book and lecture after lecture, in a manner that some found almost stubbornly plain, the same few things he had found to be true, that the human being is fundamentally a creature in search of meaning. That meaning can be found in creation, in encounter and love, and in the attitude one takes toward what cannot be changed, that the last of the freedoms cannot be taken, and that life, addressed rightly, is not something that owes us an explanation, but something that asks us a question, hourly, and waits for our reply. And so we come, at the last, back to the apartment in Vienna in the late summer of 1941, to the young doctor, holding the visa, unable to choose, walking the streets and sitting in the cathedral and finding no answer, and then seeing a fragment of stone on a table. We can see now what that moment was. It was the first full test of everything he had theorized, and the beginning of everything he would become. He was asked, in the most brutally concrete form imaginable, whether he actually believed what he taught, whether meaning is really to be found in the situation one is actually in rather than in the situation one would prefer, and whether a person can answer the question life is putting to them, even when the answer is likely to cost them their life. He answered it. The answer did not save his parents, and it did not save his wife, and it very nearly did not save him. And out of that answer, and the 3 years that followed it, came a small book written in 9 days by a grieving man in a ruined city, which has since found its way into the hands of many millions of people who were looking, in their own circumstances, for a reason to go on, and has given a great number of them one. This is what he left us, and it asks nothing of us tonight, but to be received. He left us the will to meaning, the recognition that beneath our hunger for pleasure and our striving for significance, There runs a deeper need. For a why, for a task, for something that requires us. He left us the three roads: the meaning we make through our work, the meaning we receive through beauty and through love, and the meaning that remains available even in the face of what cannot be altered. He left us the turning of the question, the counsel to stop asking what we expect from life and to begin listening for what life is asking of us in this hour, in these particular circumstances, with these particular people. He left us the tragic optimism, the yes said not because the world is kind, but in spite of the fact that it often is not. And he left us the last of the freedoms, the one that was tested in the worst place there has ever been and was found in some people, still standing. The freedom to choose one's own attitude, one's own way, in any given set of circumstances whatsoever. There is no hurry now, and nothing to solve, and nothing left to prove. The question that a small boy asked in the dark of a Vienna bedroom, whether the passing of everything empties it of meaning, was answered by the old man he became, and the answer was no, that nothing is irretrievably lost, that everything we have done and loved and suffered is stored safely in the past, where no one can take it from us, that the granaries of the past hold the harvest of a life, and hold it permanently, and that this is why the transitoriness of our days is not a reason for despair, but the very thing that gives our choices their weight. Rest now, in the knowledge that whatever this day asked of you, you answered it in some fashion, and that the answer is already gathered in and kept. Let the questions of tomorrow wait until tomorrow, when they will be asked again, gently, and you will be there to meet them. And let the last thought before sleep be the simplest of the things he found in the darkest of places, that a person who has a why can bear almost any how, and that the why is rarely far away, and is often no further than the face of someone you love, held quietly in the mind, in the dark, more real than the rising sun.